Welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to our time together on Dialexicon. I don't know if you've watched any of the interviews, but they can be quite short, and you're invited to just be in the moment. The answers don't need to be comprehensive. They can just be what's there for you at that time, at this time, at this time.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Do you want to tell us where you are, just so we can be situated?
Sure, sure. So here is actually Frankfurt, Germany. So it's an interesting place to be a Puerto Rican migrant from Philadelphia most recently. But the most
Um,
important thing is that all of my food things that I need to survive living in Deutschland, I can find them courtesy of the African and Asian stores that are here, and a very small corner store called the Rincon Latino, where I am on a first name basis with both of the owners.
Amazing. If they have an Instagram, I hope we can give them a shout out. Sorry, I'm prone to tangents. That's one reason I choose this practice, to really sink down into not trying to do all the things. Um, your amazing book, Sordidez, just the hold it up, hold it up. Yes. So haunting, so epic. Um, you just completed the audio book, and I'm so excited to taste it with my ears. And there are so many themes running through it. um, I'm committed with Dialexicon to offering a question, and you can accept or decline, and we can regenerate a question. So we start with a word, and one that you dropped a little bit in your preamble was migrant. Do
Mhm.
you want to start with, what does migrant mean to you?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question because if you look back at the history of so many different communities in the world, there's so much. There's the history of migration is the story of the human experience in a lot of ways. And as somebody who is a Caribbean person, I'm Puerto Rican. What does that mean exactly? It means that I am a meshwork of three different continents that were brought together under very violent circumstances, but that produced through their mingling a kind of unique culture that my book in part is trying to recuperate, especially the indigenous and African parts of the story that colonialism and slavery sought so desperately to destroy and erase.
Yes. And I love, so then our second question, and it's a two-question interview, is again, it's an offer, so accept or decline. But when you were describing and I'm so present to the movement of migration and the way that the earth moves and we move on it, and you talked about meshwork. And I wonder if you want to sink into what is that a is could that be a key word for looking at sort of your concept, your insights, and your story?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it is actually. It's a great word to think with for a couple of reasons, and I spontaneously prepared two props that might actually be helpful to elucidate that to some degree. So the first is in the indigenous cultures of the Caribbean, the Taínos and the Gallinagos. There are a certain kind of deity, especially for the Taínos, called the Semi, and this is the Semi, which is a living deity that is encased in and lives inside of stone or wood, and it's carved by hand. And the ancestral practice was to kind of construct a hut for these specific deities and to honor them. But as you can see, there's a kind of meshwork happening in the actual body of this particular deity, and that meshwork is very similar to something that you might see growing in the ground. And so this is Yukahu. Yukahu is the deity of cassava. So cassava or juca is what we call it. And so there's the literal kinds of these roots that were the foundational crop. So in the same way that corn was such an important crop for the Maya peoples, who are also in some ways depicted in this book, and there's a lot of inter exchange between the two cultures. Cassava or juca was the holy or the foundational crop for the Taino people. But I think also this extends to, we can think a little bit more, broadly about meshing. And one of the other things that the story is trying to capture the spirit of is this idea of the maroon, which, if you think back to the history of the Caribbean and the way that the indigenous peoples were enslaved by the Spanish and other Europeans, but then also because of this slavery and the forced labor under the encomienda system, so many people died. And many fled into the wilderness to escape the reach of the Spaniards, who were really ill-equipped to traverse that terrain. And later, West African peoples, Yoruba peoples, Igbo peoples, and others, Congolese, were brought, enslaved people to work and replace the indigenous workforce, which was largely decimated. And many of them fled as well, and they fled to those same sanctuaries in the wilderness, and they built these communities together. And so many of the traditions that we call indigenous are also African traditions, because there was a lot of exchange between these peoples. They had solidarity in their experience of slavery at the hands of the Spanish. And I will say another thing that they brought, which I think is beautiful, is this tradition, which you also see in South America and Brazil, is the abayomi dolls. And these are dolls that were made out of kind of twists in fabric, so kind of literal meshing, right? These twists of fabric, and they were made by women mostly, and they were a kind of a symbol of continuity, a symbol of fortune. Abayomi means in Yoruba languages, it means precious meeting. So the coming together of different peoples, the coming together of traditions, the continuity, the survival. And so that for me is what the meshwork is. The meshwork is the braiding together of all of these traditions. It's the persistence of traditions that the Spanish sought so desperately to crush and erase. And it is survival, and it is about not becoming extinct. And that is what we are as Puerto Ricans now in the Caribbean. We are the debris, or we are what remains. And I think that is important to recover that story. That's what I hope this book does. And a lot of my stories are trying to do is to recover and recenter that history, and not pretend, that the terrible part didn't happen, And then I will say, lastly, the last part of the meshwork is it's all the beautiful stuff that these cultures brought to the Caribbean, that the Taino have brought to the Caribbean, and the Yoruba and West African peoples. But there's also the Spanish legacy, and every day I have to think about that meshwork. There is a part of the meshwork that is me, that is the colonizer who did all of these things. So what does it mean to be all of these things simultaneously? To be the descendant of the people who committed a horrific genocide and slavery and so forth, but also the people who were enslaved and nearly exterminated. That is a sobering kind of truth that every day I have to I face. And so the other part of the book is to not overly romanticize what it means to be Puerto Rican, to also be critical of white privilege, of the continuing dispossession and disenfranchisement of Black Puerto Ricans, Afro Puerto Ricans, which some identify as and others don't. And do they need to? That's the question. Why should they have to at all, right? And this is if it really is a multiracial society, why must one be hyphenated and another not, another community not? So that, I'll just leave it there. Meshwork is very complicated, just like the story of migration. But I think that it's so important for us to remember and to pass on that memory. And that's what fiction writing for me and my art is all about.
That was so perfect and so complete. I'm going to